Well, back again with another TGP recap. And today was actually a very interesting day. I think that, whenever we were talking about the storyline yesterday, about how Perplexed, Pages Per Hour, Mad, Shinra Tensei, and Mandatory were all, tied at that 42 point threshold whenever they were doing time trials. This one came right down to the wire where Perplexed, Pages Per Hour, and Madge, all within the final, 30 minutes of the day, were in hot contention of being eliminated. Perplexed, unfortunately, had a couple of falters, not being able to time an Azure Vault in a timely manner. We left like yesterday with like a 19-1 chest, and so that took them a while to be able to get that pushed up to a 21. On top of that, I think it took them a little bit longer than they really wanted to in the Algethar Academy. And as a result, Perplexed was the team that was eliminated today. Now that sets us up with a final day of Mandatory, Shinra Tensei, Madge, and Pages Per Hour. Shinra Tensei, I would say, had a nearly perfect day. Mandatory also looking very strong. Madge and Pages Per Hour are 1 point behind Shinra Tensei and Mandatory, but Mandatory is the only team that's really leading the field. I could see that Mandatory plus any two of these other three remaining teams as being the teams that make it into the finals. For the maps that we saw today, we had Algethar Academy with Fortified Volcanic Spiteful, so a pretty lenient affix set, and Brackenhide Hollow with Fortified Storming Bursting. Now, we did have Brackenhide during the time trials, but it was like Tyrannical Sanguine Volcanic, which is a much harder affix set than the one that we saw today. So that kind of calls into question, like, what's the max key level? It seems like we're reaching a point where 21s of every single dungeon are doable, and 22s of most dungeons aren't doable. So we're going to be looking at a lot of chase keys tomorrow. Obviously, you're going to spend, an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours pushing up that final day key. But then that leaves like a 3 hour, maybe 3.5 hours for pushing up a lot of these chase keys. Those are looking like, Halls of Infusion 21. I think that's pretty reasonable. Azure Vault 22. Algethar Academy 22 seems doable but hard. Noku Defensive 22 is a big check on Sanguine management. Brackenhide 22 also seems possible, but it kind of comes down to how much of the teams have practiced and, how much time are they going to reasonably have to be able to do these things. A lot of tech today shown off. First and foremost, we have Perplexed in the bottom left here, showing off a large bird snap. So if you've watched live a lot, you'll see teams snapping a bunch of Vile Lashers into the Guardian Sentry, and that is pretty common. What isn't necessarily common on live is Evokers doing this, where they get slow-falled, they use one hover charge to cover the gap, they get caught in this Croth zone, and the Croth zone ports you up to the platform. Then you tag these birds, and you have to get back across. And so what the Evokers have to do is they have to talent Time Spiral to get double charge of hover, and then whenever they press Time Spiral, get double charge of hover, then they're able to press Wernstone far enough into the gap, and then get that Wernstone off right before they hit the death plane. And if they press that Wernstone like a millisecond too late, they're going to die to the death plane. If they get that Wernstone off, then they'll end up on the platform. You also see they'll be pressing the Ward of Faceless Ire on themselves as well to make sure that they're able to live the melees once those birds snap, because they snap instantly. You see a shine here, able to get that bird snap done. And then once this comes into the pack, this probably saves you somewhere in the order of 30 to 45 seconds on the key. And so this is a key that the timer is really tight if you're holding W through the dungeon, but if you're doing these very elaborate and intricate snaps, it speeds up your timer a lot. And so you saw Perplexed being able to pull that off there. A lot of the teams were able to do it. I just picked a POV from Perplexed. For Mandatory actually tried the 21 Halls of Infusion, and they were going to be really close. It was kind of a question as to whether or not they were going to make it. Their lust was coming up. They were going to have their twos here in a little bit with this bloodlust available to them. The boss is at 45%. This is going to be a race to the finish. It looked like maybe they weren't going to make it, but it seemed like, if they give it another effort, another try, that they would have been able to do it. Unfortunately, they get one shot where Skylarked is going to get undertowed, and undertow completely claps your tank on this fight. Even it doesn't really matter. And then once he dies to the undertow, I guess he dies to waterlogged. Then the boss kills everybody off. It happens. It happens to literally everybody. Yeah. In other tech news, so we saw this a little bit in season 1, whenever Preservation Evokers were stasising their Cauterize and being able to dispel the bleeds off of all the players. However, Pages Per Hour, the team that I saw bring this back, I think other teams were actually able to pull this off, but they were stacking up their range DPS and they baited this branch. So whenever the ancient branch was getting summoned, they baited it away from the pack, and they used landslide to root it. And what you see right here is double dwarf has been used on Crims and fired up. Sang caught himself. So now Drogo and Yoda are the only people that have that bleed on them. And so whenever that branch is left off to the side, they're going to have to go through this phase with Drogo and Yoda having that debuff on them. And Drogo's probably just going to set a ward on himself. He's going to like Iron Bark himself. He's just going to make sure that he lives here. Yoda realistically should also be fine. So both of these players are fine. This branch is still caught in this landslide, and it's going to be coming in here in a second. And what this does is before the second branch is thrown out, or like right before the second branch is thrown out, you're going to be killing off this first branch and making sure that you're never having this bleed at any given moment. And what this allows you to do is it allows you to actually do a ton more damage to the boss, as opposed to ever having to prioritize down this branch before that burst forth cast. What you're instead doing is just letting the Shadow Priest and Fire Mage cleave passively kill off this branch. Drogo is going to get like caughted basically on CD here, or maybe the debuff from the bleed even fades before that second branch fades. I think he's going to get caughted here to make sure that he doesn't have 2 stacks from Sang. Yeah, you see that cauterize coming out. And now basically the first branch is going to die off. And I think this is a great strat. We saw it a little bit in season 1 again with the stasis cauterize and like warlocks banishing the branch, but I hadn't seen it since. And having access to multiple dwarves in your composition and that augmentation evoker really does make this possible. On top of that, we learned something about the invokers at the end of the dungeon today that I didn't know until today. So if you didn't know this, now congratulations, you're watching a Titles YouTube video, but the invokers, apparently their missiles will only target players that are in front of them. So all of this garbage where you're tanking the pack like in the doorway and the invokers are facing you and they're able to missile you should stop. What Mandatory does here is they're actually tanking this pack, and they're able to do pretty much this entire area into the corner. And what this does is it allows their ranged DPS literally to stand always behind these invokers, and this makes the invokers never cast on them. Hopeful is going to be in melee, trying to stop the Echo Knights and whatnot, and trying to allow Skylar to really stay in melee as often as possible. But this allows you to go even bigger in this area than you otherwise would, and making the timer even easier. Again, if you're holding W in this dungeon, timer very challenging. If you're doing weird stuff like snapping in this large invoker pull, like you see from Mandatory here, then you're able to do really cool stuff. After they kill off the invokers, of course, they're able to take the Echo Knights into the boss, and it's not even the end of the world. Last thing I had was look at Madge in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So pretty much all the TGP teams did this. Again, this was the first team that I actually saw do it on screen, is all of the TGP teams are running Mass Root in this dungeon. And what Mass Root does is there is this hunter that's patrolling right here. That guy's a menace. You don't want him. However, all the hyenas that patrol with him aren't actually linked to that mob. And so you see all of the resto druids running this Mass Root and leaving these hyenas rooted off to the side. This will then allow Lamike to grab these hyenas and take them into the boss for free count. Count's kind of weird in Brackenhide Hollow. There's a ton of mobs that you can play, but there's not that many mobs that you want to play. And so having these bonus hyenas, first off, it also allows you to walk around this left side here, as opposed to having to, hug through this little gap. But on top of that, it just gives you a little bit more count inside of the dungeon. And those are a lot of really cool things. Predictions for tomorrow, I think that Mandatory is probably safe to be looking into to go into the global finals, although I'm not positive on it. They've been playing exceptionally well. Shinra Tensei, Nerf is playing out of his mind, and their team is looking super solid, so I kind of expect them to make it as well. And then it's kind of down between Pages per Hour and Madge. If I had to make a wager, I would suspect that Madge is going to be making it through with Shinra Tensei and Mandatory. And we have like the top 3 that we had today moving on to the global finals, but I could see a world where there's a pretty large shakeup. As you do see here, the time tiebreaker is not in Pedro's per hour's favor, and they've had some slow strats in a couple of dungeons, which is the reason that I'm a bit concerned. But again, this is the TGP. Tomorrow's going to be a heavy push day. So if you enjoy like the pushing keys as opposed to any of like the 2 chests and whatnot, make sure you tune in for like the last 2 to 3 hours of that. You are going to get like basically only chase level keys, where these 21s and 22s that are really on the cutting edge and like, oh, are these able to be timed or not? Those are the keys that we're going to be seeing a lot tomorrow. All in all, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys later. Goodbye.